Nick is an aspirant to the Order of Intervening, and so I have the pleasure of working with him in that process. I didn't know, well, I did know he gardened a bit, but I didn't know you were a real farmer collecting food, harvesting food. Nick is also, I find anyway, he's a frequent speaker, and I find always he presents a kind of a fresh perspective on things, which I find very appealing. So I'm really excited for him to share with us his ideas about peeling back the layers to reveal the source, the inner being. I guess we'll find out exactly how he wants to say it. So thank you, Nick, for being here.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you all and see you today. So I wanted to start with a quote by Shunryu Suzuki, and I think this is his quote. And he said that the work we're doing is so important that we must not take it too seriously. So with this talk, I'm going to be talking about some things that are very important to me and to this practice of meditation, but it's important not to take what I say too seriously. And so on that note, in my talk, I gave a point on Shrek and the donkey having their conversation about the onion. And at one point, the donkey is talking for so long that Shrek looks at him, trying to get him to stop talking, and says to him, "Donkey, onions have layers. Ogres have layers too." And he shows him this onion, and the donkey kind of stops talking after that. So I'd like to kind of pick up where Shrek left off. I think an onion is a good kind of metaphor for what kind of happens in the meditative practice and kind of the different levels that we might see ourselves at in our own psyche. So when we did the 3 jewels, we bowed to the Buddha nature that we all have within us. And all beings, all creatures have that Buddha nature within us. But I think sometimes we don't always live from that Buddha nature, and sometimes it can be hard to access. And so I'm going to tell a variety of stories about the Buddha, some aspects from my own life, and some kind of mythological stories to get underneath how to get to that kind of Buddha nature and what exactly that means. So starting with the first layer, I call this kind of the layer of self. And in the Buddha's life, before he became the Buddha, he was Siddhartha Gautama, and his father was rearing him to be a great political leader, a king. And in doing this, his father protected him from all suffering. He built a wall in their kingdom, and he didn't let in any old people, any sick people, or any signs of dying, and he protected him completely. So before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha was just Siddhartha. He was living at this everyday level of personality, of just being who he was, and throwing these great parties and engaging in various pleasures all throughout his life. And that was kind of the centerpiece of his life before he decided to leave. And sometimes in our culture, we can see where we ourselves can be stuck at this layer as well. When we get focused on chasing after kind of fame or likes on social media, when we get too caught up in thinking about how much we're getting in our lives, how we can make more money, etc., this can be kind of being stuck at a more superficial layer of being. So when we come to the meditation practice, our thoughts might be filled with kind of self-referential stream of thinking. And it's important to kind of ask what takes us beyond this layer. What can take us beyond that first layer of just being stuck in our personality and our personal life and get us to a kind of deeper, more expanded sense of being? When I ask myself that question, I think of two major things that can get us beyond this first layer, which are those two things, I think, are suffering. So sometimes suffering, when we are able to, when we're stuck at this layer, focusing on pleasure, sometimes suffering can take us to questioning kind of what is the meaning of life? What is a deeper way of being? Is this way I'm being right now really all there is to life? So suffering can do that. If it wasn't for suffering in my personal life, I wouldn't have found this meditation community. I wouldn't have found Thich Nhat Hanh, and I'm not sure where I would be today. So to some degree, I have to be grateful for the suffering that I've encountered in my life. Another thing that I think can take us beyond this layer is the sense of mirror neurons, which are the neurons in the brain which cause us to empathize with other people, and just generally empathy and compassion in general. When we see another person stub their toe, a lot of times we don't just react and casually say, you know, that's that person, it's whatever. We can see deeply, and sometimes we even kind of feel that pain. We say, ouch, wow. So those mirror neurons, that sense of empathy, that basic sense of empathy really shows us that maybe we are connected in a deeper way. Maybe it's not how I've just been looking at it as me, myself, and I. Maybe there's some kind of deeper connection going on here. So in the Buddha's life, he didn't feel fulfilled from all this pleasure that he was constantly experiencing. He wanted to see if there was something more. And so eventually he took a trip outside of the city walls that his dad had created, and he encountered death, suffering, and old age. Death, sickness, and old age. And once he saw those things were there, he realized that he couldn't just keep existing at this level of Siddhartha, who was about to be king. He had to leave that area and go into a deeper realm of being. So that brings us to the second layer. And I think this is symbolized by the Buddha leaving his home, leaving the safety of his home and going out. And for the first part, he goes out for 6 years or so, the numbers vary, to seek with other spiritual masters in his culture. And they're kind of within this mythology of the yogi that he studied with in India, who would teach him different kind of meditative techniques and different subtler levels of seeing. But in the end, these didn't completely satisfy him. So I call this second layer the metaphorical or mythical layer. So to kind of elaborate this, I'd like to just tell my favorite story, my favorite Greek mythology story, which is the story of Orpheus. So Orpheus is a Greek, and he plays the lyre, and he has a great musical talent, similar to Cornell, who can play beautiful music that is so beautiful that it causes the satyrs and the nymphs, those which are the half deer, half human beings, to come out of the forest and just gather around him and listen to his wonderful, beautiful music. Even the gods come down from the heavens in disguise to listen to the beautiful music that Orpheus has to play. And he's skilled with whatever instrument he picks up. And it's just a mesmerizing experience to be around him. One day, Orpheus falls in love with a beautiful woman, and they join together, they get married, and Orpheus couldn't be happier. He continues to play his music, and everything seems to be going well. However, one day his wife sadly gets sick, very sick, and she dies. And it's great tragedy. And Orpheus stops playing music, he becomes depressed. And after a while, he decides that he's going to journey down to the land of Hades, the land of the dead, and try to retrieve his wife. So he makes the journey down there, and it takes a long time to get down to the place where the dead go. He has to go down scraggly rocks, down countless stairs. He has to go through these different treacherous realms. Eventually, he gets down there and he crosses the river Styx, and he meets with Hades, and he sees the three-headed dog, Cerberus. And he says to Hades, "Hey, my wife is in there somewhere. You're watching over her soul. Please bring her back to me." And Hades says no. And so Orpheus is like, okay, what do I do now? Eventually, he's kind of hanging around a little bit, and Hades' wife has compassion on him and says to him, "Orpheus, you don't have to just go away, but if you play some of the greatest music you've ever played in your life, it might open Hades' heart and he'll let you bring your wife back up from the depths." So Orpheus says, "Wow, that's great. I can definitely cook something up." He brings out his flute again, and he starts playing this beautiful, stunning piece of music that is so amazing that everyone in the underworld gathers around to listen, and they're just totally inspired by this music. So he plays it, and he asks Hades again, "Hey, can I bring my wife back up?" And Hades says, "Yes, you can." So his heart's been changed. He says, "Yes, you can, but on one condition. And that one condition is you will have to walk up through from the lower world back up to earth, and your wife will follow you, but you can't turn around and look at all, not even once. If you do turn around and look, she will have to return to the depths." Wow. So he's got quite the task ahead of him. Maybe if he had met Thich Nhat Hanh and learned to do some mindful walking, that might have helped him in his journey up towards the depths. But he says, okay, I can do that. That should be easy. And he starts walking up. Again, it takes a super long time to get up there. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks pass. And as the time passes, he becomes more and more doubtful. He remembers the look on Hades' face. He said, "Did Hades just trick me to try to get me out of there?" He becomes more and more doubtful as to whether or not his wife is actually lingering behind him. So he gets closer. He starts to see the glowing circle to pass from the lower world to this world. And he says, he eventually reaches his breaking point. He takes his mind off of the object and he looks back in doubt. And sadly, he sees his wife standing there. And there's a moment of, wow, like you were actually there. And then she gets pulled back down to the underworld. So that is a story that is pretty tragic. Orpheus goes back up, but his life is never the same. And he has this deep despair, this deep suffering that will never get solved for him. Something about that story strikes me as very sad, but also very beautiful. I think that's the beauty of being on the mythic or metaphorical layer. I think maybe we can see ourselves in his story in certain ways. Maybe we've had a loved one who died, and we see ourselves looking at the Lord of the Underworld trying to get them back. Maybe we see ourselves as one of the nymphs sitting in a circle listening to some beautiful music being played. I think the layer of myth can be helpful, but in some ways it can also be unhelpful. Some cultures have great myths, but at the end of the day, and if you look back in history, a lot of cultures have been okay with enslaving certain people and also, causing a lot of death and suffering to cultures that otherwise were pretty fairly innocent in some ways. I think on the level of myth, sometimes we can get caught in an ideology as well, which can be another trap in some ways that prevents us from seeing things clearly and dwelling in the present moment. But the layer of myth reminds us that we're part of a bigger story, part of a bigger narrative than just I, me, and mine. And so when we go back to the Buddha, he studied with all these spiritual teachers who showed him some pretty important things in his practice. But at the end of the day, he said, that's not going to get me to where I need to be. He still had this longing deep inside to alleviate suffering and to find the truth. And he ended up leaving these spiritual teachers behind and going to sit under the Bodhi tree. So one thing that gets us beyond the second layer of myth is this longing for the truth, is this thirst for something that goes beyond something that is not giving us the totality of what we need to hear, of what our soul longs to hear. And what gets us beyond this layer also, some things are war, plague, some deep global suffering sometimes gets us to transcend this level of ideology as well. So the third layer is, I call it the layer of symbol. This is where the Buddha leaves to go sit beneath the Bodhi tree. And he goes there and he sits down and he says, I'm not leaving this place until I know the truth, until I've gotten that experience of what is real, what is true, of this way of alleviating suffering. And so one story that I found that kind of illuminates this is the story of Hachiko Waits. It's a child's book that's based on a true story, and I'm going to summarize it here. And I read it in one sitting. It's pretty short, and I thought it was a really great story. And so the story goes like this. There's a dog and there's an owner, and the dog loves his owner. And every day the owner goes to get on the train, and he gets on the train and goes to work. And one day the dog decides to come with him to the train station. And even though the owner says, no, you can't come to the train station, it's a very busy station, you can get lost, the dog persists, and he comes along and he sits by the door while the owner gets on the train and goes off to work. So the train operator, or the train manager guy that stays at the station, knows the dog and knows the owner, so he decides to watch over the dog. And so Hachiko sits there and waits, and the owner's train comes back, and people are standing around wondering, where is he? The owner doesn't come back. It turns out that day he went to school, he went to his job, and when he was coming back, he had a heart attack and he passed away. And so Hachiko waits, and people try to get him to get the dog to go back home. They say, all right, your owner's not coming. The train pulls in, train after train pulls in, and he's not there. The dog still doesn't go back home. And so Hachiko waits, and he sits there, and he sits there, and he sits there. The day passes, the sun goes down, the sun comes up. Months start to pass, and weeks, and then years start to pass as well. And Hachiko still stays there waiting in the exact same spot. He doesn't go home. He doesn't go to sleep. He goes to sleep in the exact spot where he is. And then when the first train comes in, he gets up again and starts waiting. And gradually people start finding his story important. This is kind of the point where Hachiko goes just from being this cute little dog that belongs to one person to, he starts to go deeper into the layer of symbol, and he starts to become a symbol of inspiration to a lot of people. And so the train station operator kind of stands near Hachiko and kind of absorbs these stories that people come. And some of them say, I was feeling so sad, I was going to give up on my relationship, on my job, on this goal that I had. But then I just remembered Hachiko sitting there and waiting. And I decided to persist. I decided to keep going. So Hachiko gradually becomes a message of hope. He becomes a symbol of hope and persistence and endurance. He's not doing anything special. He's just sitting there, just breathing, kind of like we do in our practice, just waiting. And gradually, people look forward to seeing Hachiko every single day as they board their train. And one day, Hachiko has waited for 5-10 years. And one day it becomes time for him to die. His life ends, and people get really sad. They say, Hachiko was a great dog, but it doesn't end there. With a symbol, there's a kind of layer of deeper of something that goes beyond our own human life, our own single lifetime with a symbol. You can see this in figures like Mother Teresa or Gandhi or MLK or Thich Nhat Hanh. They have these beautiful symbolic qualities that go beyond just their own life and continue to influence people outside of their own life. And so there's a statue built to Hachiko, and he's sitting in that exact spot in the train station, and people look at him and they become really inspired by who he is, and they remember his message, and they find hope through the story of the dog just sitting, just obediently waiting for his owner. So Hachiko is a special story. It's about going to the layer of symbol, and the Buddha sits, and he sits for long enough that he finds the answers. He finds the experience of enlightenment. He finds a way of being that transcends the mythic and the personal, and something that can be shared with all beings all over the world. And so I also see that story in the story of Christ as well, going off and living a life that symbolically aligns with many people in many ways. So I think at this level, this third layer of symbol, this is where real love exists. This is where deep love and compassion can come from. And deep healing is the emphasis as well. So just thinking about that for a minute, that symbolic layer of deep love and compassion, of inspiration that goes beyond just this human life, and also a way of being that incorporates something beyond just your culture and just your mythology. So in Buddhism, we talk about benefiting all beings everywhere. We're not just trying to benefit the other Buddhists. We're trying to benefit all beings through the way that we're living, through the way that we're practicing. And I think that's important to go to that stage of not trying to cause suffering for other people. And I think that's a really important part of this practice. So those are the three layers. We have the personal, we have the metaphoric, mythic layer, and we have the third layer, the layer of symbol. But hold on, is there another layer beyond that? It's hard to tell. I think this layer kind of is with the third layer, but there is the idea of nirvana, or the Pure Land, or the Tao, or the kingdom of God. It's got a lot of different names, but I think this is kind of a realm beyond personal, beyond symbols. Symbols have to come from somewhere, and I think this is kind of where those deeper symbols come and are at play. So when talking about this realm, it's kind of better not to actually talk about it, because I think words are symbols and they can get lost when we talk about this element of being. But to quote, I'll just name two quotes, and that might help elaborate this a little bit. So this comes from the Tao Te Ching, and it says, "Empty your mind of all thoughts. Let your heart be at peace. Watch the turmoil of beings, but contemplate their return. Each separate being in the universe returns to the common source. Returning to the source is serenity. If you don't realize the source, you stumble in confusion and sorrow. When you realize where you come from, you naturally become tolerant, disinterested, amused, kind-hearted as a grandmother, dignified as a king. Immersed in the wonder of the Tao, you can deal with whatever life brings you, and when death comes, you are ready." So that common source, that level of being, might just be the fourth layer. And then the last part was a quote from this book, Old Path, White Clouds, the story of the Buddha's life. And it talks about the first jewel, the jewel of the Buddha. So what does it look like to be a person that lives from this third or fourth layer? I thought this quote highlighted it pretty well. The Buddha is the awakened one. An awakened person sees the nature of life and the cosmos. Because of that, an awakened person is not bound by illusion. My dog's sneezing in the background. Because of that, an awakened person is not bound by illusion, fear, anger, or desire. An awakened person is a free person, filled with peace and joy, love, and understanding. Master Gautama, our teacher, is a completely awakened person. He shows us the way in this life so that we may overcome forgetfulness and become awakened ourselves. Every one of us contains Buddha nature. We can all become a Buddha. Buddha nature is the capacity to awaken and transcend all ignorance. If we practice the way of awareness, our Buddha nature will shine more brightly every day, until one day we too shall attain total freedom, peace, and joy. We must each find the Buddha within our own heart. The Buddha is the first precious gem. So there we go. We have the Buddha nature within ourselves. It's our duty to find it. And when we sit and when we practice here together, we're getting closer to that Buddha nature. So there you have it. The first layer, the layer of personal. The second layer, the layer of symbol. The mythic layer. The third layer, the layer of symbol. And the fourth layer, it's kind of that place from which the symbols come, from which it all comes. Thank you for listening, and welcome any questions or concerns you may have. Big bowing out.
Thank you, Nick.